I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but set is actually short for sete. Hello, friends and enemies. Welcome to Horror and Inconvenience, where things are usually spooky and always weird. As you can see, I'm in the process of putting together a new set. It's not finished yet, as you can tell by the fact that there is some element of, tidiness and even minimalism to it. That's not something I would normally allow. But as the set is unfinished and I needed to squeeze this video in before Garbaugust officially ends, here we are. Now, eagle-eyed viewers may notice that I've only really participated in this event with one video, and it's not out of any disinterest in it. It's because I am very bad with deadlines, and when I tell myself I have to read a certain book by a certain time, I tend to get grad school flashbacks and go into a little anxiety coma and a reading slump, which is what happened here. But I did manage to cover my two biggest reading goals for this month. See, when I realized I was going to be participating, at least in some small way, in Garbaugust, I thought immediately of a book series that my dad got me started on when I was in middle school that he said was one of his favorite as a child, and which I've recently come to realize is pretty trashy, and that is the Xanth series by Piers. So, in the interest of fairness, I asked my mother what her favorite trashy childhood book was so that I could do a side-by-side and compare, which is how I ended up finally reading Flowers in the Attic. So, this is my legacy of trash. Let's get into it. I'm actually going to start with the first Xanth book, A Spell for Chameleon, which I just finished rereading. Again, me, reading deadlines, not a thing. And as you can see from the state of this book, it was a favorite of mine as a kid. I must have read it several times. It's been on at least 2 or 3 cross-country moves with me. It barely stayed in one piece while I was rereading it this time. I'm probably going to have to retire this as a reading copy, which is all very well because I can't really foresee wanting to reread this again. As many of us discover with things we loved in middle school, it's a lot worse than I remembered. First, I want to talk about some of the good things, because my whole life I have remembered this series very fondly and thought fairly high of it for, your sort of run-of-the-mill fantasy stuff. Xanth is a magical land in a peninsula cut off from the mundane world, our world. And everybody in it has a minor magical talent that they're born with. Occasionally someone's born with a huge, really useful talent. That person is a magician, and those people are the only ones eligible to become king or queen. So, A Spell for Chameleon follows Bink, who, as far as anyone's ever been able to observe, has no inborn magical talent, and therefore, if he can't show magical talent by his 25th birthday, he will be exiled from Xanth. This really is a whimsical fantasy world based a lot on puns and the subversion of expectations, a lot of very silly reversals. And that's kind of the spirit of the whole plot of the story as well, which can be a lot of fun. Piers did have a sense for undercutting fantasy tropes. Unfortunately, the fantasy tropes he had no interest in undercutting were all of the sexist ones. I don't think this man knew he hated women. I think if you'd asked him, he probably would have said he loved women. Somehow he had a wife and 2 daughters who don't seem ever to have disowned him. And, yeah, he just got to keep writing these incredibly sexist and incredibly horny books for as long as he lived. Um, but there are some real problems. First of all, and there are going to be spoilers for this, if you really care about the plot of A Spell for Chameleon, I guess skip ahead till I'm holding flowers in the attic. But you don't care about the plot. Yeah, so the main love interest, really one of the three main characters in this, is Chameleon, whose magical talent is really something of a curse, where in the course of a month, she transitions from being very beautiful and very stupid to completely average, and then to being very intelligent and very ugly. See, this is great for Bink because he can never decide what kind of woman he wants to be with. He's constantly finding himself attracted to random women he meets and then getting bored with them. But with Chameleon, there's variety. He first meets Chameleon in her beautiful and stupid phase during a village rape trial where random men and three random women are chosen to stand in order to spare, I guess, the rapist and the victim from being identified. It's very apologetic and trades a lot on stereotypes that false rape accusations are plausible when they almost never happen, and that, well, did a woman put herself in a position where she was vulnerable to the man, and how malicious was the man's intent, that sort of thing. It's like, it's bad. Sorry, I didn't remember this part at all from when I read it as a kid, and I don't know. I remember being, for a 12-year-old who grew up in Ohio, pretty up to date on basic modern concepts such as the rape is never the victim's fault. So I can only imagine that I rolled my eyes and skimmed past it. But I'm surprised it didn't bother me enough to remember. Anyway, Chameleon in her pretty phase is one of the women involved in the sham trial, and since she is headed to the same magician Bink is headed to try and solve her problem, they end up traveling together for a while. Then they're separated, and Bink meets the utterly average version of her, whom he quite likes. That's pretty uneventful, other than saving her from a dragon by what later turns out to be complete coincidence. But then, when he finally is exiled from Xanth, spoiler, and ends up on the shores of Mundania and meets the man who used to be an evil magician in Xanth, he's captured and thrown into a cell with the intelligent and ugly version of Chameleon, who calls herself Fanchon. Through it doesn't matter what plot devices, they do end up back in Xanth, and, well, because they crossed on the ocean, they are all naked. By the way, Bink makes some oddly horny observations about the evil magician, who apparently, though he's a little bit older, is still super handsome and super swole, and it's really important that, to Piers Anthony, that we know this, and that we know that Bink noticed it, and then thought about it for a while. So they're wandering the jungle naked, and I just want to give you a sample of how Piers Anthony talks about women so that you can really just share my irritation for a moment. Fanchon spotted a fabric plant and efficiently fashioned togas for them all. The men tolerated this with good humor, having become accustomed to nudity. Had Fanchon been a provocatively proportioned woman, there might have been more reason and less desire for bodily concealment. Still, Bink remembered how she had professed modesty in the prison pit, so as to gain a private section in which to hide the bricks she used to attempt their escape from the prison. She probably had her reasons this time, too. Because why would a woman exposed to the elements in the jungle care about clothing herself and her companions unless she was worried about the gazes of men, right? Anyway, the whole thing's like this. He's every time a female character is on the page, he is constantly not only observing her appearance and how it affects her environment and her own view of herself, but also analyzing every single action she takes in the light of how her appearance interacts with the men around her. It's all about the men around her at all times, relentlessly. He wastes so many words on this kind of thought that you have to wonder what a minefield it would have been to be in a room with this man. Anyway, there was actually some charm to it. I did, by the end of the reread, remember why I liked these books growing up. There is a lot of whimsy and humor. Some of it's bad, but some of it's actually pretty entertaining. There's some interesting magical creatures and concepts in here. The world building as the series goes on actually gets pretty complex, and it's generally pretty internally consistent. So it's often very satisfying, and the protagonists of these books are often fairly regular people who, either by stupid luck or by common cleverness, manage to stumble their way through impossible situations surrounded by larger-than-life heroes and villains whose own heroism and villainy are often undercut as tropes. So there's a lot to like in these books. However, I don't think there's enough to like to put aside the disgust I felt at the way women are talked about in these books, and I don't think I could handle a full reread of the series. By full reread, I mean about the first 10 books. There are over 30. I never read them all, but I know I read a lot of them growing up, and I have about 10. Anyway, so much for him. Flowers in the Attic is a pretty regular read here on Horror BookTube, but this was my first time through it, and I actually found myself pretty charmed and engaged the entire time. It's not high quality writing, obviously, and I assume everyone watching this knows, but in case you somehow don't know, Flowers in the Attic is about 4 children, siblings, who get locked in the attic of an old house by their grandmother and mother, stay there for 3 years as prisoners, and the older 2 children, raising the toddler-age twins like their own, fall in love with each other. It's ghastly. It's a gothic story, and as a gothic tale, it's actually pretty effective. You have your sweet, passionate, inherently relatable, but also unusually beautiful and talented protagonists. You have your evil mother figures. You have confinement and incest and fear and abuse and repression. All of the tropes that make gothic horror what it is are in here, and they're used pretty effectively. This book does its job. And if its job is to shock and horrify you, to give you cheap thrills and cheap sympathy for the poor wretches that the story centers on, I had a lot of fun reading it. This book also carries a lot of internalized sexism, a lot of weird cishet ideas about what gender and romance are, and it also includes a rape scene, so I guess it's not that much better than the Piers Anthony in that respect, because of the way the rape scene is framed. there are more thorough discussions of this book already out there. If you have any confusion about that, it's bad tropes that are used to frame that scene. Uh, but I don't know. To me, there's something that makes the experience of reading a book full of internalized misogyny on the part of a woman writer a lot easier to swallow than reading a cishet man's very external misogyny. Uh, you know, it's, and I know I'm saying this literally about flowers in the attic, so do take it with a bucket of salt, but it's more thoughtful in the case of V.C. Andrews, who grew up in the mid 20th century in the southern United States, um, confined with a very religious, very repressed family. I mean, she's working through this stuff for herself as she's writing it, I assume. Most writers are working through stuff for themselves. For instance, Piers Anthony was working through what was more important to him in a woman, having a brain or having a good figure. He decided on both. But yeah, so there's a lot of fucked up stuff in this, not just the plot, but the way the plot is clearly used to work out buried taboos and internalized prejudices and self-doubt on the part of the society that this book grows out of. Um, I just, this book was kind of page-turning delight for me, despite the fact that I knew the whole plot, having watched the Lifetime version with my mom ages ago. I found it was full of surprises, and it gave me a lot to think about. I actually picked up the sequel, which I happen to have sitting around, as soon as I finished this. I'm not quite as wild about it. I've kind of been picking it up and putting it down since, but I'll probably eventually finish the whole Dollenganger saga, and I'll get back to you on that. So, this is some trash that I read. Thanks, Ollie, for putting together the event, and I'm sorry to anyone else who is putting together another cool reading event in the next couple of months that I probably won't participate in because trying to give myself deadlines threw me into a reading slump, and I'm just now getting out of it. And I might even be putting off some projects that I have assigned to myself and haven't even told anybody about because of it. So, thanks for listening to my reviews and looking through this unasked for window into my mental health issues. Love you guys, and I have absolutely been loving everyone's videos this month.